Clara Weston pressed both hands flat against the iron gate and pushed her forehead against the cold metal and said out loud to nobody but the morning air and God and whatever was left of her pride, "Please." She hadn't said that word in 8 months. Not when the bank came. Not when they buried Daniel. Not when the pains woke her at 3 in the morning and she had to bite her own fist so the girls wouldn't hear her cry. But she said it now. She said it to a closed gate and a man who wasn't even watching. If this story moves something in you, subscribe to this channel and drop your city in the comments. Let me see just how far Clara's story travels. And stay with me until the very end, because what happens between a broken woman and a closed-off man in the summer of 1883 is something I promise you won't see coming. The letter from Harlow County Savings and Trust arrived on a Monday. Clara knew what it was before she opened it. She'd been knowing for 3 weeks, the way you know a tooth is going to have to come out. Dreading it, putting it off, telling yourself maybe it won't be as bad as you think, knowing full well it will be worse. She set it on the kitchen table beside the bowl of oats she'd made for Ruth and May, and stood there looking at it while her daughters ate breakfast and talked over each other the way they always did. Ruth explaining something with great authority, May ignoring her with great serenity, and Clara stood with both hands on the back of her chair and looked at that envelope. "Mama," May said, "you're not eating." "I'm not hungry, baby. You have to eat." May was 5 years old and delivered this observation with the gravity of a physician. "The baby needs it." "I know, sweetheart." Ruth said if you don't eat, the baby comes out small. "Ruth," Clara said. Ruth, 9 years old, the image of Daniel from the jaw up, didn't look up from her oats. "I said it was possible. I didn't say it was certain." Clara pulled out the chair and sat down and put a spoonful of oats in her mouth and tasted nothing. She looked at the envelope. She would open it after the girls left for school. She would open it and read it, and then she would think. That was the plan. She was very good at plans now. She had been running on plans and nothing else since October. Daniel had been gone 8 months. 8 months since the horse threw him on the North Ridge. 8 months since she'd had to tell a 9-year-old and a 4-year-old May, had just turned 5 in March, that their father wasn't coming home. 8 months of managing the 40-acre parcel Daniel had spent 11 years building the garden, the chickens, the 2 remaining milk cows, the woodpile that went down faster than she could rebuild it, with hands that shook at night when she finally stopped moving, and a stomach that was getting harder to work around every week. She was 7 months along. The baby came in August. She had not let herself think past August. August was the wall. She dealt with what was in front of the wall, and she did not look over it. After the girls went to school, she opened the letter. It was direct. The bank was always direct. 72 days past due on the outstanding loan balance. Total amount owed $214. If payment arrangements were not made within 30 days, foreclosure proceedings would commence on the property at. She stopped reading. She folded the letter. She set it down. She pressed her hands flat on the table, and she breathed. $214. She went through the numbers the way she always went through them, not because they changed, but because the counting gave her hands something to do, while the rest of her worked through what came next. She had $11 in the tin on the shelf. The eggs brought in roughly $2 a week if the hens cooperated. She had 3 jars of preserves she could sell at the dry goods store for maybe $1.50 each. She had Daniel's pocket watch, which she had not sold and was not going to sell. She had 40 acres of land that a bank was about to take back. She sat with the numbers for a long time. Then she put on her coat, smoothed her dress over her stomach as best she could, and walked the 4 miles to town to talk to Victor Pruitt at the land office. Pruitt was 32, well-dressed, with the kind of smile that practiced itself in mirrors. He stood when she came in, which was a courtesy, and he gestured to the chair across from his desk, which was also a courtesy, and then he told her there was nothing he could do, which was neither. "Mrs. Weston." His voice was careful. The way you're careful with something breakable, that you're also not personally responsible for. The bank's position is clear. The loan was in your husband's name. His estate. His estate is me, and 2 little girls and a baby coming in August, Clara said. And 40 acres of land that's been farmed for 11 years. I understand that, truly. He folded his hands on the desk. But without a co-signer or a guarantor, the bank has no legal basis to extend the arrangement. If you could bring in someone, Clara said. A male relative, a business associate of your husband's. Someone willing to stand as guarantor for the outstanding balance that would give us a mechanism to work with. Clara looked at him. She thought about her family. Her mother was in Ohio, widowed herself, living on her sister's charity. Daniel's brother was in California and hadn't written in 2 years. She thought about the men in Harlow County. She went through them the way you go through a drawer looking for something you've misplaced. There were good men in this town. There were men who had shaken Daniel's hand at church and called him a friend. Most of them had also not come by in 8 months. Not once. There was one man she hadn't thought of because she'd made a deliberate decision not to think of him. Mrs. Weston, Prewitt said gently. Do you have anyone who might? I'll find someone, Clara said. She stood. It took more effort than she let show. Thank you for your time. She walked out into the July heat and stood on the boardwalk and pressed one hand to the small of her back and one hand to the side of her stomach where the baby was pushing against her ribs, in that particular insistent way it had lately, as if to say, I am here. Do not forget me. I haven't forgotten you, she said quietly. The 2 women passing on the boardwalk glanced at her and away. She didn't care. She stood in the heat and thought about Caleb Harrow. Everybody in Harlow County knew who Caleb Harrow was. He owned the largest cattle operation in the territory, 4,000 acres running from Soldier Creek all the way up into the Ridge Country, running 300 head, employing 15 ranch hands and a foreman who'd been with him since before the war. He was 40 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that women had once called handsome and now called difficult, and a reputation for fair dealing that was entirely professional and entirely impersonal. He had a wife once, Margaret. He had a son, Thomas, 8 years old when the flood came 4 years ago. The Soldier Creek flood of 1879 had taken 3 homesteads and a bridge and 2 lives, and both of those lives had been Caleb Harrow's. Since then he came to town when he had business. He conducted it. He left. He did not attend socials or church services or the harvest dance or any of the gatherings where Harlow County attempted to know itself as a community. He was not rude about it. He simply was not present in the way that a man can be physically absent from a room while being entirely gone from it in every other sense. Clara had met him exactly once 3 years ago, when Daniel had bought a bull from the Harrow Ranch. She remembered a handshake and a price discussed, and a man who looked through the conversation rather than at it. She had no reason to approach him. She had no connection to him, no prior claim on his attention, no grounds to walk up to a man like Caleb Harrow and ask for anything. She had 2 daughters and a baby coming in August and 30 days. She went home. She fed the girls supper and got them to bed and sat at the kitchen table with the lamp burning low and the July night coming in through the window screen, and she thought about every alternative she had, and she thought about them honestly and without self-pity, which was the only way thinking was useful. At midnight, she blew out the lamp. At midnight and 10 minutes, she relit it. She was going to the Harrow Ranch in the morning. She told herself the whole walk out the next day, 4 miles in the July heat, with her back already aching, before she'd gone a mile, that she was going to be calm, professional. She was going to state her situation clearly and make a reasonable proposal and accept whatever answer she was given with dignity. She was not going to cry. She was not going to let him see how afraid she was. The baby pushed against her ribs the whole walk out, as if it already knew, as if it were trying to remind her of the weight she was carrying, as if she needed reminding. The main gate of the Harrow Ranch was iron, the brand worked into the crossbar. A ranch hand she didn't know was mending fence nearby, and he looked up when she came to the gate, and
This
then
story
looked at
was
her stomach,
posted on the channel
and then
The
looked at
Rusty
her
Saddle.
face,
Please
and
do
he
not
got the
repost it
particular
in any
expression of a
form.
man encountering a situation he had not planned for. "Help you, ma'am. I need to speak with Mr. Harrow. My name is Clara Weston. My husband Daniel Weston purchased a bull from this ranch 3 years ago. I don't have an appointment." The ranch hand studied her. "Mr. Harrow don't see people without—" "I know," Clara said. "I'm asking you to tell him I'm here anyway." Something in her voice, she didn't know what the steadiness may be, or the effort behind the steadiness, made him nod slowly. He set down his tools and went toward the barn. Clara waited. The heat pressed down. She could hear cattle in the distance. She could hear a hammer striking an anvil somewhere behind the main barn, regular and rhythmic, the sound of a man deep in work and unbothered by the world. The hammering stopped. She heard boots. She heard them before she saw him, a long, deliberate stride, unhurried, the walk of a man who had decided long ago that he was not going to hurry for anyone or anything. Caleb Harrow came around the corner of the main barn with his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow and his hat pushed back, and he stopped when he saw her at the gate. He looked at her face. He looked at her stomach. He looked at her face again. He didn't say anything. He just walked to the gate and stood on the other side of it and waited with his arms at his sides. "Mr. Harrow," Clara said. "Thank you for coming out. I know you don't know me well. I'm Clara Weston, my husband Daniel." "I know who you are," he said. His voice was low and flat. "Your husband passed in October." "That's right." She steadied herself. "I have a situation, and I'm going to be direct about it, because I don't imagine you value anything else." Something moved in his eyes. Not quite interest. The reluctant attention of a man who has decided to get this over with. "The bank is 30 days from foreclosing on my property," Clara said. "I owe $214. I have 11. Victor Pruitt at the land office says the bank needs a male guarantor to extend the loan arrangement. I don't have family in the territory. I don't have a business partner. I have 40 acres and 11 years of my husband's work and 2 daughters, and," she stopped, started again. "I need someone to stand as guarantor. It doesn't require you to pay the debt. It requires your name and your signature. I would repay the full amount plus interest terms of your choosing over whatever period you consider reasonable. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a signature." Caleb Harrow looked at her for a long time. Long enough that she had time to count the seconds and get to 12. "No," he said. Clara had been ready for it. She had told herself the entire walk out that he would say no, and she would thank him for his time and walk home and think of something else. She had been very specific with herself about this. "Mr. Harrow, I don't do business with—" He stopped. "It's not a business I'm in. I can't help you." "Can't," Clara said. "Or won't." His jaw shifted. He looked at her directly. "Does it matter?" "It matters to my daughters," she said. "It matters to this child." She put one hand on her stomach. Not a performance, just the truth of where things stood. "They've already lost their father. I am doing everything I know how to do to make sure they don't lose their home as well. I came to you because you are the one man in this county with the means and the standing to make this arrangement work. I'm not asking you to love us. I'm not asking you for anything that costs you more than your name on a piece of paper." Something crossed his face, fast gone. His eyes dropped to her stomach and came back up. "There are other men in this county," he said. "I've been through the other men in this county," Clara said. "I came to you." "Why?" She looked at him steadily. "Because you're the only one I believe is honest enough to hold to the terms." That landed. She watched it land. He didn't move, but something shifted behind his eyes, some small internal reckoning, and then it was gone, and his face was flat again. "No," he said, quieter this time. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Weston. I can't help you." He turned toward the barn. "My daughter Ruth," Clara said to his back. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out anyway. She's been keeping a ledger. 9 years old, keeping a household ledger because she's afraid. She records every egg we sell and every penny we spend, and every night she thinks I'm asleep, she checks the numbers. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that, desperately proud of it. She learned that from her father. He kept the same ledger. She found his and copied his handwriting. Caleb Harrow had stopped walking. She doesn't know about the bank letter yet, Clara said. I haven't told her. I don't know how to tell a 9-year-old that her father's handwriting in a ledger might not be enough to save the only home she's ever known. He stood with his back to her. His shoulders were set. She could see the tension in them from 15 feet away. Then he turned around. He didn't say anything. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't name, something old and raw that moved across his face like weather and was gone before it fully arrived. Go home, Mrs. Weston, he said. I'll send word. Mr. Harrow, if you're going to say no, I said I'll send word. His voice wasn't harsh, but it was final in a different way than before. Final, the way a door sounds when someone closes it from the inside without locking it. Go home. Get out of this heat. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded. She turned and walked back down the road toward Harlow. She didn't let herself think about what I'll send word meant. She had learned in 8 months to be very careful about hope. Hope was expensive. Hope had a way of costing you the exact thing you couldn't afford to lose. She walked home. Ruth and May were back from school when she arrived, May sitting on the porch step with a handful of clover, and Ruth in the kitchen, already starting on the bread. Clara came through the door, and Ruth looked up from the dough and read her face the way 9-year-olds who have been carrying adult worry for 8 months learn to read faces. Mama, Ruth said. What happened? Not a question, a statement. A child who had learned the difference between the two. Nothing happened, Clara said. I had some errands in town. You walked 4 miles in July in your condition for errands. Ruth. Mama. Ruth's voice was quiet. She had Daniel's voice when she was being serious, that same low measured tone that meant she was not going to be redirected. I know about the bank letter. Clara went still. How? I saw it on the table Monday. I know what Harlow County Savings letterhead looks like. Ruth set the dough down. Her hands were floury and her jaw was set. I checked the ledger. I know what the numbers are. I've known for 3 weeks. The kitchen was very quiet. Ruth, Clara said, I'm not a baby. Ruth met her eyes. I'm not May. You don't have to protect me from the numbers. I can do the numbers. Clara crossed the kitchen. She put both hands on her daughter's face, floury hands and all, and looked at her directly. Ruth's eyes were dry. Ruth never cried where anyone could see it, hadn't cried since the day they buried Daniel, as if she'd made a decision that day about what her job was now, and that job didn't leave room for crying. I know you can do the numbers, Clara said. I know exactly who you are and what you're capable of. And none of this is yours to carry. It's already mine to carry, Ruth said quietly. That's not me complaining. That's just what's true. Clara pulled her daughter close. She held her. Ruth allowed it the way she allowed most displays of affection, with a brief, rigid resistance, and then a slow letting go, her face pressed against Clara's shoulder, her floury hands at her sides. I went to the Harrow Ranch today, Clara said. Ruth pulled back. Caleb Harrow. He's the largest landholder in the county. He has the standing the bank requires. What did he say? He said he'd send word. Ruth was quiet for a moment, processing this with the focused intensity she brought to everything. Do you think he will? Clara looked at her daughter. She thought about a man standing with his back to her shoulders, set, not walking away. She thought about the particular quality of his silence when she'd mentioned the ledger. I don't know, she said honestly. I think he might. May appeared in the kitchen doorway in her good dress, which she had put on for no reason that was ever explicable, trailing a length of clover chain behind her like a bridal veil. Mama, she said, I made 47 loops. That's a record. That is a record, Clara
This
agreed.
story was
and her
posted on the
voice came
channel
out
The
almost
Rusty
even.
Saddle. Please do
I'm
not
going to give them
repost
to
it in
somebody
any form.
important, May said. When I find somebody important enough. How will you know? Ruth asked. May considered this with the unhurried seriousness of a 5-year-old philosopher. I'll know, she said. People look different when they're important. Their eyes look like they used to know something good. Clara stood in her kitchen between her two daughters and pressed her hand briefly to the side of her stomach, where the baby was moving, and she thought August. Get to August. And underneath that thought, quieter and more frightening, she thought about a man who had not walked away, who had stood with his back to her and said, "Go home," in a voice that did not sound like a closed door anymore. That sounded like a door that someone hadn't decided yet whether to open. The word came 2 days later. Not a letter. A knock at the door. Clara opened it, and Caleb Harrow was standing on her porch with his hat in his hands and his horse tied at the end of the path. He looked like a man who had gotten on the horse 3 times and turned back twice, and on the 3rd attempt had made himself ride all the way here, and she was going to find out later that this was exactly what had happened. He looked at her stomach. He looked at her face. He looked past her into the kitchen. "Mrs. Weston," he said. His voice was rough. "I've been thinking about what you said, about the ledger." "Come in," she said. "I'm not sure that's Mr. Harrow." Her voice was quiet and direct. "It's 94 degrees on this porch, and I've been on my feet since 5 o'clock this morning. Come inside." "Oui." He came inside. He stood in her kitchen with his hat in his hands, and he looked at the small table and the 2 chairs and the shelf where the bread tin sat, and Daniel's photograph between the candle holder and the dried flour. May had once declared too important to throw away, and he stood there like a man relearning what it felt like to be inside a house that had people living in it. "I'll sign the guarantee," he said. "The full amount. Terms are straightforward. You repay what you can when you can. No interest. No schedule I'll hold you to." Clara set down the cup she was holding. "Mr. Harrow, that's not what I proposed. I proposed—" "I know what you proposed. I'm telling you what I'm willing to do. I'm not asking for charity." "It's not charity." He met her eyes. Something in them was flat and certain, and also underneath something she couldn't quite name. "It's what I'm offering. You can take it, or you can go back to Prewitt and find someone else. But that's my arrangement." Clara looked at him. He was not going to be argued with on this. She could see that. Not from stubbornness exactly, but from something more decided than stubbornness, the look of a man who had made up his mind in private and was not going to unmake it in public. "Why?" she said. He turned his hat in his hands, looked down at the brim. "My son kept a ledger," he said. 8 years old. He kept it because I kept one, and he wanted to do what I did." The kitchen was very quiet. "Mr. Harrow," Clara said softly. "Don't." He shook his head. Not unkind. Just a boundary she could see clearly. "I'm not looking for—" He stopped, started again. "You asked why. That's why. That's all I've got." Clara looked at this man standing in her kitchen, this closed-off, weathered, difficult man holding his hat. Like a man holds something he doesn't know what else to do with his hands. And she thought, "There you are." She didn't say it, but she thought it. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He nodded. He moved toward the door. "Mr. Harrow." He stopped. "Would you stay for supper, I think?" She chose her words carefully. "If we're going to take this to the bank together, they'll want to understand the arrangement. It would help if we knew more than each other's names." He stood at the door with his hand on the frame. She could see the pull of retreat in every line of him. 3 years of eating alone. 3 years of knowing exactly what was on the other side of a door like this one, and choosing not to open it. Then May's voice came from the back of the house, bright and completely unaware of its own timing. "Mama, is someone here? Does he look important?" Caleb Harrow looked at the hallway. He looked at Clara. Something shifted in his face. "I reckon I could stay," he said. May appeared in the doorway in her good dress clover chain in hand and looked at Caleb Harrow with the complete unself-conscious scrutiny of a 5-year-old who has developed very specific criteria. She looked at his hat. She looked at his hands. She looked at his face. His eyes looked like he used to know something good. May said to no one in particular. And Clara, who had been holding herself together for 8 months with plans and numbers and the sheer refusal to let anything crack open, turned to the stove so that the man standing in her kitchen would not see her face. She stirred a pot she hadn't started yet and breathed and told herself firmly and clearly that this was a practical arrangement. A signature on a piece of paper. A business arrangement between two people with a shared interest in a reasonable outcome. She told herself that twice. She almost believed it once. Supper was not what Caleb Harrow had planned for his Tuesday evening. He knew that. He was aware of it the entire time he sat at Clara Weston's kitchen table, with a plate of beans and cornbread in front of him, and a 5-year-old on his left, who had decided without consulting anyone that he was interesting. May had pulled her chair close enough that her elbow was touching his arm. She had placed her clover chain on the table between them, like an offering at an altar, and she was watching him eat with the focused attention of a scientist observing something she hasn't classified yet. "Do you have a horse?" May asked. "I do." "What's his name?" "Ranger." May considered this. "That's a strong name. Ruth's doll is named Ranger. Ruth says she named it before she knew it was a doll name." "May," Ruth said from across the table without looking up. Ruth had been watching Caleb with an entirely different quality of attention since he'd sat down, the careful measuring attention of a child who has learned to assess adults for reliability. "It's fine, Caleb said. He looked at Ruth directly. "Your mother tells me you keep the household ledger." Ruth looked up. She hadn't expected to be addressed. "Yes, sir." "Your father teach you?" "I taught myself from his." A pause. "He kept it in a brown cover. His handwriting was neater than mine." "It gets neater," Caleb said. "With practice." Ruth looked at him for a moment. "Did you keep one when you were young?" "Started at about your age. My father's was in a green cover." Something moved in Ruth's face. Not softness exactly. More like the recognition of a specific kind of information, the kind that tells you a person is real rather than performed. She went back to her food, but the set of her shoulders had changed slightly, some fraction of the tension going out of them. Clara at the stove refilling the coffee pot heard all of it and said nothing. She filed it away the way she filed everything now carefully, in the place where she kept things she needed to think about later when there was time. "How many cows do you have?" May asked. 300 head, give or take." May's eyes went wide. "That is a lot of cows." "It is." "Do you know all their names?" "Cows don't generally have names." May looked genuinely troubled by this. "That seems lonely for them." "May," Ruth said. "They have each other," Caleb said. 300 of them. They're not short on company." May processed this and seemed partially reassured. "I'm going to name one when I grow up. I've decided. I'll name her something cheerful." "Good plan," Caleb said, and something in his voice was almost warm. Almost. Like heat from a fire in the next room. Clara set the coffee on the table and sat down, and the four of them ate in the particular kind of quiet that happens when people are still learning the shape of each other. Caleb ate with the focused economy of a man who'd been up since before dawn and hadn't stopped, and he didn't make conversation for the sake of it, which Clara had expected, and which she did not mind. She had never had much patience for conversation that existed only to fill silence. After supper, she got the girls to bed. May went without argument, which was unusual enough that Clara checked her forehead for fever. Ruth went after extracting a promise that Clara would explain the full situation with the bank in the morning, a promise Clara made because Ruth was 9 years old and already keeping the ledger and had earned the truth. When she came back to the kitchen, Caleb was still at the table. She hadn't asked him to stay. He hadn't announced he was leaving. He had simply remained the way a man remains in a place when he hasn't
This story
decided
was
yet
posted
what
on the
right
channel
thing
The
to do
Rusty
is.
Saddle. Please do not
Clara poured
repost it
coffee
in
for
any
both of
form.
them and sat down. "She's going to be all right," Caleb said. "The older one." "I know," Clara said. "She's already more all right than she should have to be." He turned his cup in his hands. He had a particular way of doing that she noticed a slow rotation, like he was thinking through something, and the movement helped. "How far out is the baby?" "August, 6-7 weeks." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. "You have anyone coming to help when the time comes?" "Agnes Ford. She's my nearest neighbor. She's done it before." Clara paused. "She's been good to us." "Agnes Ford," Caleb said. "Walt Ford's widow." "That's right." He nodded again. Another rotation of the cup. "I'll have my man Dillard check your wood supply before the week is out. You're going to need more than you've got before August." Clara looked at him. "Mr. Harrow, the arrangement we discussed was a financial guarantee, not—" "I'm aware of what we discussed." His voice was level, not unkind. "I'm telling you what I'm going to do in addition to that. I don't need Mrs. Weston." He looked at her directly. His eyes were a particular shade of gray that she hadn't noticed at the gate, the kind of gray that had blue in it once she thought, and had weathered towards something stiller. "You've got 6 weeks until that baby comes. You've got a 9-year-old keeping your household ledger and a 5-year-old naming imaginary cows. You've got a wood supply that won't last 3 weeks and a fence on your north line that's been down since spring. I could see it from the road. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering the kind of practical help that a neighbor ought to offer and hasn't." Clara held his gaze. There was something in his words, not in the offer itself, but in the particular anger underneath it. A quiet, directed anger, not at her, but at the situation, at the 8 months of neighbors who had shaken Daniel's hand at church and not come by once. She recognized that anger because she had been carrying a version of it herself. "All right," she said. He seemed slightly surprised that she'd conceded. He looked down at his cup. "Thank you," Clara said, "for coming. I know you—" She stopped, chose the next words carefully. "I know this isn't the kind of thing you do." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "It isn't." "Why did you, really?" She watched him. "You said it was the ledger, but you rode out here and turned back twice before you made yourself come to the door. Agnes Ford's boy saw you on the road." He looked at her. His jaw tightened just slightly. "Agnes Ford's boy ought to mind his own affairs." "He's 11, Clara said. He was curious." Caleb was quiet. He turned the cup. He looked at the table, and then he said without looking up, "My son's name was Thomas. He was keeping the ledger because he wanted to know how the ranch worked. He wanted to know everything about how it worked. He used to follow me around asking questions until I was half out of my mind." He stopped. His voice had gone rough at the edges. "I would give anything in this world, to have that back." Clara said nothing. She sat very still, and she let the words be what they were, without trying to manage them. "When you said your girl was keeping the ledger," Caleb said, "I couldn't—" He shook his head once. "I couldn't walk away from that." "I'm glad you didn't," Clara said quietly. He looked up. For just a second, something in his face was unguarded, in a way that she suspected he was not aware of, and would not have permitted if he had been. Then it was gone, and he was picking up his hat from the hook. "I'll have Dillard out Thursday," he said. "About the wood. Mr. Harrow." He stopped. "Would you come to the bank with me Friday? Prewitt will need the guarantee in writing. It would help to have you there." He put his hat on. "I'll be here at 8. He left. Clara stood at the door and listened to the sound of hoofbeats going down the road into the dark, and she thought about a man who had turned around twice. She thought about the way he'd said Thomas, the name landing in the room like something he'd been carrying a long time and had set down for just a second before picking it back up, She told herself clearly and firmly to be careful. She had 2 daughters and a baby coming in 30 days, and a business arrangement with a man who had his own grief and his own walls, and absolutely no obligation to anything beyond the signature he had promised. She was going to be careful. She went to bed. She lay awake for an hour listening to the night. Friday came. Caleb arrived at 8 exactly, which she was beginning to understand was simply who he was. A man who set a time and appeared at it without drama. He was in a clean shirt, and he had shaved, and he held his hat in his hands when she opened the door, and he said good morning to her, and then May appeared from behind Clara's skirt, and said, "You came back," with the same tone she might use to observe that the sun had risen inevitable and correct. "Said I would," Caleb said. "Mama said you were probably busy." He looked at Clara over May's head. Clara looked back at him without apology. "I said you might be busy." Ruth came out of the kitchen with her coat already on. She had decided, apparently without discussion, that she was coming to the bank. Clara had decided equally without discussion not to argue about it. The 4 of them walked into Harlow together. Clara was aware of the picture they made. She was aware of the eyes that followed them down Main Street, the particular quality of attention that a small town gives to something it hasn't categorized yet. She kept her chin level and her pace steady. Caleb walked beside her. He didn't touch her arm. He didn't speak to the people who watched. He simply walked with the unhurried certainty of a man who had decided where he was going and was not interested in commentary on the subject, and somehow that was enough. The watching eyes slid off him and moved on. Victor Pruitt stood up very fast when they came through the land office door. "Mr. Harrow," he said. His voice had acquired a careful new quality, the specific deference of a man recalibrating quickly. "I didn't know you were, that is Mrs. Weston, I didn't expect." "Mr. Pruitt." Caleb's voice was even and impersonal. "I understand you need a guarantee for the Weston property loan. I'm here to provide it. What do you need from me?" Pruitt looked at Clara. He looked at Caleb. He sat back down. "Well, yes. If you could sign the guarantee form, and I'll need to note your landholding as collateral basis." "Note the Harrow Ranch," Caleb said. 4,000 acres clear title. That ought to be sufficient." It was more than sufficient. Clara could see it in the way Pruitt's pen moved quickly without the usual delicate pauses of a man managing a difficult situation. He pushed the form across the desk. Caleb signed it without reading it, which Clara noted, and which told her he had already satisfied himself as to its contents before he walked through the door. He was not a man who signed things he hadn't considered. Pruitt extended 30 days. Then, looking at Caleb, he extended 60. Caleb looked at him. Pruitt cleared his throat. "Given the circumstances, 90 days seems reasonable." "It does," Caleb said. They walked out into the morning. Ruth was holding Clara's hand, which she rarely did in public, a concession to something she didn't have language for yet. May was holding Caleb's. She had simply taken it when they came out the door, the same complete, unself-conscious confidence with which she did everything, and Caleb had looked down at her small hand in his large one, and something crossed his face that Clara caught and did not comment on. "Are we going home now?" May asked. "In a little while," Clara said. "I need to stop at the dry goods store." "Can Mr. Harrow come?" May. "I can come," Caleb said. Clara looked at him. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who has surprised himself and is not entirely sure what to do about it. They were in the dry goods store when Harriet Doyle found them. Harriet Doyle was the banker's wife, which in Harlow County meant she occupied a particular position in the social architecture, not quite the top, but close enough to it, that she had developed strong opinions about who belonged where. She was a tall woman, with careful hair, and the kind of smile that had been refined over many years into something that looked warm and operated cold. She materialized beside Clara with the ease of long practice. "Clara Weston," she said warmly. "And is that—" Her eyes moved to Caleb and went very still for just a moment. "Mr. Harrow. My goodness. I don't think I've seen you in the store in... Mrs. Doyle. Caleb's voice was flat and civil. What a surprise.
This story was posted on the channel The
Harriet's
Rusty
smile
Saddle.
rearranged
Please do
itself.
not repost it in
Her
any
eyes
form.
moved between Clara and Caleb, and down to where May was still holding Caleb's hand, and back up. I had no idea you two were acquainted. We are, Clara said pleasantly. How lovely. The warmth in Harriet's voice had acquired an edge so fine you could only see it at an angle. I do worry about you, Clara. All alone out there in your condition. It's such a difficult situation. She let the word difficult sit for just a moment too long. If there's anything the ladies' auxiliary can do. Mrs. Doyle. Caleb spoke without raising his voice. I appreciate the charitable impulse. Mrs. Weston is managing her affairs. She doesn't require the auxiliary's attention. Harriet blinked. Her smile held, but only barely. Of course, she said. I only meant... I know what you meant, Caleb said. His voice was entirely civil and entirely impenetrable. A door closed from the inside. You'll excuse us. He moved forward one step unhurried and absolute, and the three of them moved with him, and Harriet Doyle was left standing in the dry goods store, with her smile turned uncertain, and her carefully assembled concern, suddenly without an audience. Ruth, walking on Clara's other side, said very quietly, She wasn't worried about you, Mama. No, Clara agreed. She wasn't. She wanted to know about Mr. Harrow. That's right. Ruth was quiet for a moment. He handled it well. Clara glanced down at her daughter. Ruth was looking straight ahead with the expression of a judge reviewing a verdict she has mostly but not entirely reached. On the walk home, May talked about the things she'd seen in the store window, with the comprehensive enthusiasm of someone delivering a field report. Caleb listened. He asked one question about whether the blue ribbon or the yellow one was better, which sent May into a 4-minute deliberation. Ruth walked and said nothing, but at a certain point she moved close enough to Caleb's other side that she was walking within arm's reach of him, which was Ruth's version of approval. Clara watched all of it and kept her face forward and her pace steady and told herself she was not reading anything into it. She was not going to read anything into a man walking her children home from the bank on a Friday morning. That was a fact and a practical arrangement, and nothing more. At the gate, Caleb stopped. He had somewhere to be, he said. The ranch didn't run itself. He said it without apology, which she respected, the plain statement of a man's obligations without performance around it. Mr. Harrow, Ruth said before Clara could speak. Caleb looked at her. Ruth was looking at the gatepost, not at him, with the sideways approach of a child who has something to say and is deciding how to say it. My father used to say that a man's word was the only collateral that couldn't be foreclosed on. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Your father was right, he said. Ruth nodded. She went through the gate without another word. May waved with her whole arm and followed. Clara stood at the gate. The morning was bright and loud with birds and the smell of dry grass and the particular July heat that had been pressing down on the territory for 3 weeks without relief. She looked at Caleb Harrow, standing beside his horse, with his hat in his hands, again that same gesture, and she thought he probably didn't know he did it. I meant what I said at the table Thursday night, he said, about Dillard and the wood. I know you did. He put his hat on. He didn't move. Mrs. Weston. He looked at her. Something in his face was working toward a thing he hadn't fully decided to say. You were right what you told Pruitt in there, about being the one you believed was honest enough. Clara waited. I don't know if that's entirely deserved, he said. I've been... He shook his head slightly. I haven't been much of a neighbor to anyone in this county for 4 years. I'm aware of that. You're here now, Clara said. He looked at her. That unguarded thing moved across his face again, faster this time, barely there. I am, he said, like he was still deciding what that meant. He swung up. He turned the horse. Caleb, Clara said. She hadn't planned to use his given name. It came out before she'd decided to let it. He stopped. "Thank you," she said. Not for the guarantee. Not for the bank. For the table Thursday. For the way he'd spoken to Ruth about the ledger. For the way he'd looked at May's hand in his, like it was something he hadn't known he was missing until it was there. She didn't say any of that. She just said thank you and let it carry all of it. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with his reins loose in his hands and the summer morning going gold around him. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "I haven't done much." He rode out. Clara stood at the gate until the dust settled. Then she pressed her hand to the side of her stomach where the baby was moving in long, slow rolls awake and restless in the heat, and she said quietly to no one but the baby and the morning air, "I think we're going to be all right." She didn't know yet if she was right. But for the first time in 8 months, she didn't know, with something that felt around the edges almost like hope. Dillard came Thursday with 2 other ranch hands and a wagon load of wood that was more than Clara had seen in one place since the previous October. She stood on the porch and watched them stack it against the side of the house, and said nothing about the quantity because there was nothing to say that wouldn't sound either ungrateful or foolish, and she was neither. Caleb came with them. He didn't announce this in advance. He simply arrived with the wagon in his work clothes, and when Clara opened the door, he said good morning and asked where she wanted the overflow stack, and got to work before she could formulate a response. Ruth watched from the window with her arms crossed and the expression of someone updating a mental file. May went directly to Dillard, who was young and good-natured, and made the mistake of crouching down to her level to say hello, which meant he was subjected to 45 minutes of questions about horses, cows, and whether a dog could be trained to count. Dillard handled it with more grace than most grown men would have. Caleb fixed the north fence line while the hands stacked wood. Clara brought him water at midday, and he drank it leaning against the fence post and looked out at the pasture where her 2 cows were grazing and said without looking at her, "You're going to need another hand before the baby comes, someone who can manage the heavy work." "I know," Clara said. "I can send Dillard twice a week. He's got time in the mornings." "Caleb." She said his name the way she'd started saying it without deciding to, without the formal buffer of his surname. He looked at her. "You've already signed the guarantee. You've brought the wood. You've fixed the fence. I don't know how to keep accepting things without what?" He turned toward her. His voice wasn't sharp, just direct. "Without it meaning something you haven't decided if you want it to mean?" Clara held his gaze. The honesty of it landed before she was ready for it. "Yes," she said. "That." He was quiet for a moment. He turned the water tin in his hands. "I'm not trying to complicate your situation," he said. "I'm trying to help you get to August. That's all I'm trying to do right now." "And after August?" He looked at her steadily. "I don't know," he said. "I haven't planned past August either." It was the most honest thing he could have said, and they both knew it. Clara took the water tin back. "Send Dillard," she said. "Tuesday and Thursday." He nodded. He went back to the fence. The trouble arrived the following Monday in the form of Victor Pruitt coming to her door at 4:30 in the afternoon with his hat in his hand and his practiced smile slightly off its axis, like a picture hung crooked that nobody had gotten around to straightening. "Mrs. Weston," he said, "I'm sorry to come out unannounced. Something has come up at the bank." Clara stood in the doorway and did not move back to invite him in. She had learned things about Victor Pruitt in the past 2 weeks. "What kind of something?" He cleared his throat. "There's been an inquiry from a party interested in the Weston property." He paused. "A formal inquiry filed with the land office this morning. The land is not for sale." "No, ma'am, but—" Another pause. The practiced smile was doing a lot of work. "The inquiry was filed under a provision of territorial law that allows adjacent landholders to petition for assessment of abandoned or financially distressed properties. The argument being that a property with an outstanding loan in default represents a risk to the loan is not in default," Clara said. "Mr. Harrow signed the guarantee 2 weeks ago. Prewitt, you extended 90 days yourself. Yes, ma'am, I'm aware of that. Something shifted in his face, something uncomfortable. The inquiry was filed by Mr. Aldous Greer. Clara went still. Aldous Greer doesn't own land adjacent to mine. No, ma'am, but his client does. She looked at him. Who is Greer's client? Prewitt looked at his hat. I'm not at liberty to the filing as a matter of public record if you want to examine it at the land office. I came out because I thought you deserved to know before what? He looked up. His eyes had the uncomfortable quality of a man delivering information he wishes he weren't involved in. Before the assessment hearing. It's been scheduled for Friday. This Friday, Mrs. Weston. I tried to push it to the following week, but
This
Greer
story
filed
was
under
posted on the
expedited
channel The
provision,
Rusty
and
Saddle.
the magistrate
Please do not
accepted it.
repost it in any form.
Clara's hand tightened on the doorframe. The baby moved against her ribs. Who is Greer's client? She said again, quieter this time. Prewitt was quiet for a moment. Harriet Doyle's brother, he said. James Whitmore. He's been acquiring properties along the Soldier Creek corridor for 2 years. This is the last parcel between his holdings and the creek access. Clara stood in her doorway and breathed through it. She breathed the way she'd learned to breathe through hard things steadily, without letting it show, without giving anyone watching the satisfaction of seeing it reach her face. Thank you for coming out, she said. Her voice was level as a board. Prewitt looked relieved to have delivered the thing and be done with it. He put his hat on. I am sorry, Mrs. Weston. Truly. Greer is... He shook his head. He's good at what he does. After he left, Clara stood in the middle of her kitchen for a long time. She didn't sit down. Sitting down felt like something she couldn't afford. She stood with both hands on the back of Daniel's chair and looked at the shelf where his photograph was, and thought hard and fast and without sentiment about what Friday meant. The provision Prewitt had described was real. She knew it was real because Daniel had mentioned it once 3 years ago, when a family 2 counties over had lost their land to it. A financial distress assessment could override a private guarantee if the petitioner could demonstrate that the outstanding debt represented a continuing risk rather than a resolved one. Caleb's signature bought her time. It did not apparently buy her immunity from a man with a lawyer and a land grab and a sister married to the county's banker. She needed to tell Caleb. She didn't want to tell Caleb. She had spent 2 weeks accepting things from this man that she hadn't asked for and hadn't fully reckoned with, and the idea of going back to him with another problem, another weight, another thing she needed, sat in her chest like a stone. Ruth appeared in the kitchen doorway. Who was that? Mr. Prewitt. What did he want? Clara looked at her daughter. Ruth was 9 years old and keeping the ledger and had earned the truth 4 times over. There's going to be a hearing Friday, Clara said. Someone is trying to use territorial law to challenge our claim on the property. Ruth's face went very still in the particular way it went still when something serious had happened, and she was processing it before she let herself react. Can they do that? They're trying to. Who? A man named James Whitmore. He wants the land. Ruth was quiet. Her jaw was set in a way that was so precisely Daniel's jaw that Clara had to look at the wall for a moment. What are we going to do? I'm going to talk to Mr. Harrow tomorrow. Tonight, Ruth said. Clara looked at her. Ruth? It's Monday, Mama. Friday is 4 days away. Ruth's voice was quiet and completely steady. Go tonight. Clara sent word with Agnes Ford's boy, who was fast on his feet and motivated by the promise of a piece of cornbread. The boy came back in an hour with 4 words in Caleb's handwriting on a scrap of paper. I'll be there at 7. He was there at 6:45. Clara opened the door and he came in, and she told him everything while he stood at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands and his jaw getting tighter with every sentence. She told him about Prewitt, about Greer, about James Whitmore, and the Soldier Creek corridor, and the Friday hearing. She told it plainly without performance, the way she'd told him about the bank loan that first morning at his gate. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. Whitmore, Caleb said. The name came out flat and hard. He's been buying up land along the creek for 2 years. 3 families sold to him under pressure. The Hendersons, the Coles, one other. His jaw shifted. I didn't know he had his eye on your parcel. I didn't either, Clara said. But 40 acres on the creek is worth considerably more than 40 acres without it. Greer is the problem, Caleb said. He's a good lawyer. He'll argue that my guarantee is a temporary resolution and that the underlying financial instability of the property represents an ongoing assessment risk. It's a thin argument legally, but it only needs to hold up long enough for... He stopped. Something moved across his face. Anger, she thought, but aimed at himself as much as the situation. I should have anticipated this. You couldn't have known. Whitmore's been operating the same way for 2 years. I knew his pattern. He set his hat on the table. I should have structured the guarantee differently, filed it as a permanent lien resolution rather than a conditional arrangement. Can that be fixed before Friday? He looked at her. I need to talk to my own lawyer. Tom Briggs in Abilene. I can ride out tomorrow, be back Wednesday. That's 2 days away. I know. He met her eyes. I'll be back Wednesday. The hearing is Friday morning. We'll have time. And if Greer's argument holds, Clara said, if the magistrate decides the provision applies. Caleb looked at her directly. Then I'll buy the property outright and deed it back to you. Clara stared at him. Caleb, you cannot... I can. His voice was quiet and entirely certain. I have the means. It would be a straightforward transaction. Whitmore can't petition against a property with no outstanding debt and clear title. That is not... She stopped, pressed her hands flat on the table. That is not something I can allow. Why not? He wasn't challenging her. He genuinely wanted to know, because it would make me beholden to you in a way that I... She stopped again. She looked at the table. She looked up at him. Because it changes what this is, she said. And I don't know what this is yet, Caleb. I don't know what we are to each other, and I don't know what we're becoming, and until I know that I cannot be that deep in your debt, I cannot let the girls... Her voice wavered at the edge of the last word, just slightly. I cannot let them attach to something I don't know the shape of yet. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the summer night had settled in around the house, crickets loud, the grass moving in the light wind off the flats. Caleb was looking at her with the focused, still attention that she had come to understand was how he looked when something mattered. He wasn't performing consideration. He was actually in it. That's fair, he said. Is it? Yes. He picked up his hat. He didn't put it on. I'll ride to Abilene in the morning. I'll be back Wednesday. We'll handle Friday before it comes to the other option. He looked at her. But Clara, if it does come to it, I want you to hear me say this clearly. He held her gaze. I'm not offering to buy the property because you're in debt to me. I'm offering because... He stopped. His jaw worked once. I'm offering because I don't want to see this happen to you, to them. He shook his head slightly. I haven't wanted something not to happen to a person in 4 years. I'd forgotten what that felt like. Clara held very still. That's all, he said. I'm not asking you to know the shape of it tonight. I'm just telling you it's there. He put his hat on. He moved to the door. He had his hand on the frame when May's voice came from the hallway, small and sleepy. Mr. Harrow. They both turned. May was standing in the hallway in her nightgown with her hair loose, squinting against the kitchen light. She looked at Caleb with the slow, assessing look of a child who has woken up in the middle of something important and is catching up. You're going somewhere, May said. Just home, Miss May. He said it gently. It's late. Will you come back? Wednesday, he said. I'll be back Wednesday. May considered this. She held out her arm. Hanging from her wrist was a clover chain, 30 loops at least slightly wilted from being slept on. Take this, she said, so you remember to come back. Caleb crossed the hallway. He crouched down to May's level, which was not a small movement for a man his size, and he held out his wrist. May fastened the chain around it with the solemn ceremony of a 5-year-old performing an oath. "There," she said. "Now you have to come back." Caleb looked at the clover chain on his wrist. His face did the thing Clara had
This
seen
story
it do
was
twice
posted on the
before that
channel The
movement,
Rusty
deep and
Saddle.
slow and
Please do not
unguarded, that was
repost it
gone
in
before
any
it fully
form.
arrived. His throat moved. "I'll come back," he said. His voice was rough at the edges. "That's a promise." May nodded satisfied and padded back down the hallway to bed. Caleb stood up. He looked at Clara. His eyes were very direct and very still, and she could see in them what 4 years of nothing had looked like from the inside, and what it looked like now that the nothing had started to crack. "Wednesday," he said. "Wednesday," she said. He left. Clara stood in the kitchen and listened to the hoofbeats go down the road, and she told herself she was going to sleep, and she was not going to think about Friday, or Whitmore, or James Greer, or the particular quality of Caleb Harrow's voice when he said, "I don't want to see this happen to you." She almost managed the first part. Tuesday passed. She did laundry. She sold 4 dozen eggs to the dry goods store. She sat with Ruth after supper and told her daughter the full shape of Friday, plainly and without softening it, because Ruth had asked for the truth and had earned it. Ruth listened with her hands folded on the table and her face very still, and at the end she said, "Mr. Harrow is in Abilene right now fixing it. He's trying to." "He'll fix it," Ruth said. Not a wish. A verdict. Wednesday. Caleb wasn't back by noon, which Clara had not expected him to be. He wasn't back by 2, which she had half expected. By 4, she had stopped watching the road and was focusing very deliberately on the bread she was making, pressing the dough with more force than was strictly necessary. May was on the porch making a new clover chain, a replacement for the one on Caleb's wrist, she had explained, because she needed one too. It was May who heard the horse first. She was off the porch before Clara reached the door. Caleb came through the gate with the look of a man who had ridden hard and not slept much and had something to say. He swung down, and May was already at his side saying, "You came back. I knew you'd come back." And he put his hand briefly on the top of her head, a gesture so natural she didn't think he noticed he'd done it. Clara met him at the gate. "Tom Briggs filed the amended guarantee this morning," he said without preamble. "Full lien resolution, permanent notation on the title. Greer's provision petition requires demonstrated ongoing financial distress. With the amended filing, there is no ongoing distress to demonstrate." Clara breathed. "It holds." "Tom says it holds. He'll be at the hearing Friday to argue it if Greer pushes." He met her eyes. "He thinks Greer will see the amended filing tonight and withdraw. It kills his argument entirely. And if he doesn't withdraw, then Tom argues it and wins." Caleb's voice was flat and certain. "Greer is good. Tom Briggs is better." Clara stood at her gate in the July afternoon and breathed through the loosening of something that had been wound tight in her chest since Monday evening. The baby moved a long, slow roll, and she pressed her hand to her side. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Caleb said. "Thank Tom Briggs. He rode back with the filing himself to make sure it was on the magistrate's desk before Greer saw it." Ruth appeared on the porch. She looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back at her. "The fence held," Ruth said. "The fence held," Caleb said. Ruth nodded. She went back inside. It was Clara had learned Ruth's highest form of approval. Caleb looked at Clara. He was tired in the way that went deeper than sleep, the tiredness of a man who had spent 2 days doing something urgent for someone else and hadn't stopped to ask himself why. She could see him not asking himself. She could see him deciding not to look at the answer yet. "Come inside," Clara said. "You look like you haven't eaten since Abilene." He hadn't. She could tell by the way he sat down at the table without arguing. May climbed into the chair beside him and held up her new clover chain. "I made you a spare," she said, "in case you lose the other one." Caleb looked at the chain. He looked at May. Something in his face, all that weathering, all that long-practiced stillness, went soft around the edges in a way that he wasn't trying to prevent anymore. "That's good thinking, Miss May," he said. "I know," May said. "I usually am." Clara stood at the stove and stirred the pot and listened to her 5-year-old teach Caleb Harrow the structural principles of a well-built clover chain, and she pressed her free hand briefly to her mouth, and she thought about a man who had ridden to Abilene and back in 2 days for a woman and 2 little girls and a baby who wasn't his, who had done it without being asked, who had come back with the answer before she'd finished being afraid of the question. She thought about what he'd said Monday night. "I don't want to see this happen to you. I haven't wanted something not to happen to a person in 4 years." She stirred the pot, and she thought about that, and she did not look away from it this time. She let herself look directly at it. She let herself know what it meant. Tom Briggs was a small man with a large reputation and the particular stillness of someone who had spent 30 years in courtrooms and learned that the person who moved least was usually the person who won. He arrived in Harlow on Thursday evening, shook Clara's hand at her door with the directness of a man who respected people's time, and told her in 4 sentences that Greer had seen the amended filing, had consulted with his client, and would be withdrawing the petition before the Friday hearing opened. "He'll withdraw," Briggs said, "but he'll do it in a way that leaves the door open for a future challenge. Whitmore doesn't give up on a parcel. He just waits." "How long can he wait?" Clara asked. "Long as it takes." Briggs looked at her steadily. "The best protection you have is continued financial stability and a clear title. The guarantee Caleb filed gets you through the immediate crisis. Long term." He paused. "Long term, you'll want the property's standing to be unambiguous." "What does unambiguous look like?" Briggs glanced at Caleb, who was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee and his hat on his knee, and the expression of a man who had already had this conversation in Abilene and was waiting to see how it landed here. "That's a question with more than one kind of answer," Briggs said carefully. "I'll leave it with you." He left shortly after. Clara stood at the door and watched him ride out, and then turned back to the kitchen where Caleb was still sitting. "He means marriage," Clara said. Caleb looked at his coffee. "He mentioned it, in Abilene. And—" He looked up. "And I told him that wasn't my decision to make." Clara sat down across from him. The kitchen was quiet. The girls were asleep. The lamp was burning low, and the summer night was pressing against the windows, and somewhere down the road a coyote was saying something mournful to the dark. "It would solve the legal problem," Clara said. "Yes." "It would give Whitmore no ground to stand on." "Yes." "Is that the reason you'd consider it?" He met her eyes. "No," he said. "It is not." Clara held his gaze. Her heart was doing something she wasn't going to describe even to herself. "Then what is—" He set the cup down. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands, big and work-roughed and still, and then he looked at her with the directness he brought to everything. The absolute refusal to say things sideways that she had come to understand was the core of who he was. "I have been coming to this house," he said slowly, "for 3 weeks. I have sat at this table and eaten your food and fixed your fence and listened to May explain the structural integrity of clover chains and watched Ruth update her ledger, and I have—" He stopped. "I have not felt like a man with nothing left in 3 weeks, Clara. I have felt like a man who wandered back into his own life and didn't know he was lost until he found the road again." The coyote had stopped. The night was very quiet. "I know what you lost," Clara said softly. "I know you're not. I know this isn't simple." "Nothing about it is simple." His voice was rough. "I've got grief I'm still carrying. I've got days where I wake up and for about 10 seconds I don't remember, and then I do, and that 10 seconds is the best part of the day and the worst. I don't know if that changes. I don't know when it changes." He held her gaze. "But I know that when I'm in this house, those 10 seconds are different. They're not the best part anymore." Clara pressed her hands flat on the table. She breathed. She had been carrying her own version of those 10 seconds for 8 months, and she knew exactly what he meant, and the knowing of it moved through her chest like something breaking open that had needed to break for a long time. "I'm not asking you for an answer tonight," Caleb said. "I'm not asking you for anything. I want to be clear about that. What Briggs said, the legal solution that comes later, if it comes at all. What I'm telling you now
This story
is
was
separate from
posted
that."
on the channel The Rusty Saddle.
"I know,"
Please do not
Clara
repost
said.
it in any
"Do
form.
you?" She looked at him. "Yes, Caleb. I know." He nodded. He picked up his hat. He didn't put it on. "Get some sleep," he said. "Hearing's at 9. He left. Clara sat at the table for a long time after. She sat with what he had said, and she didn't try to manage it or organize it into something practical. She just let it be what it was. At some point she realized she was crying quietly without drama, the way you cry when something that's been held in a very long time finally finds its way out. She let that be what it was too. The Friday hearing lasted 11 minutes. Greer stood up, stated that his client was withdrawing the petition in light of the amended guarantee filing, and sat back down. The magistrate noted the withdrawal confirmed the title status and called the next matter. Tom Briggs nodded once at Caleb from across the room. Caleb nodded back. Harriet Doyle was in the back of the room. Clara saw her when they stood to leave. Harriet's face was composed and neutral and entirely unreadable, which told Clara everything she needed to know about how much this had cost Harriet's brother and how unlikely Harriet was to let it go quietly. Agnes Ford, who had come in from her place 3 miles out specifically to be present at the hearing, and had told Clara that no argument was going to dissuade her from this, caught Clara's elbow on the way out and squeezed it once with the firm grip of a woman who has been through her own hard years and knows what they feel like on someone else. "That's done," Agnes said. "For now," Clara said. Agnes looked at Caleb, who was talking to Briggs near the door. She looked at Clara. Agnes Ford was 61 years old and had buried a husband and raised 4 children alone and had approximately no patience for anything that wasn't true. "For longer than now," Agnes said quietly, "if you're smart about it." She patted Clara's arm and went to collect her wagon. The 3 of them walked out into the Friday morning. Tom Briggs shook hands all around, promised to file the final documentation by end of day, and rode out. Clara and Caleb stood on the boardwalk in the July heat, and neither of them had anything urgent left to say, and both of them knew it, and neither of them moved to leave. "It's over," Clara said. "The hearing is over," Caleb said. "Whitmore isn't." "I know." She looked at the street. "But today, it's over." He looked at her sideways. "Today, it's over," he agreed. They walked back together in no particular hurry. May, who had been left in Agnes's care for the morning, and had apparently spent the time teaching Agnes's grandchildren a game that involved clover chains and a complicated scoring system, intercepted them at the edge of town with the energy of a child who has been patient for 3 entire hours and is done with it. She grabbed Caleb's hand. She grabbed Clara's hand. She looked up at both of them with the bright, complete satisfaction of a 5-year-old who has assessed a situation and found it correct. "Good," she said to no one in particular and started walking. Caleb looked at Clara over May's head. Clara looked back at him. Neither of them said anything. They walked. The weeks that followed had a particular quality that Clara recognized much later as the quality of ordinary life reasserting itself, the kind of ordinary that is only visible as extraordinary when you've been without it long enough. Caleb came Tuesday and Thursday, then sometimes Wednesday, then sometimes Saturday as well, without announcement or explanation, appearing at the gate the way weather appeared with its own logic and its own schedule. He brought eggs from the ranch 3 times when his hens outproduced the hands' consumption. He brought a crib on a Thursday in the back of the wagon without ceremony or preamble, setting it down in the room Clara had been preparing, and saying only that it had been in the barn for 4 years and ought to be used. Clara looked at it for a long time after he left. She didn't ask whose it had been. She already knew. Ruth began meeting him at the gate on his arrival days. Not to greet him exactly. To walk with him from the gate to the house, during which time she asked him specific and detailed questions about cattle management, land assessment, and the territorial law provisions that Tom Briggs had explained. Caleb answered each question with the focused attention he gave everything, which meant Ruth was getting a more thorough education in ranch operations than most adults in the county. "She's going to run something large someday," Caleb told Clara one evening. "Whatever it is, it'll be run correctly." "I know," Clara said. "I'm terrified and proud in equal measure." He smiled at that. A real smile, the kind that reached everything. He had more of them now than he'd had in July, and Clara had stopped pretending she didn't notice. May, for her part, had developed a system. Every time Caleb arrived, she presented him with a newly constructed clover chain and attached it to whatever wrist didn't already have one. By mid-August, he was arriving with 2 chains on each wrist and accepting new ones with the gravity of a man receiving important dispatches. "She's going to run out of clover," Caleb said. "She won't," Clara said. "She grows it deliberately, behind the chicken coop. She started the patch in June." He looked at her. "She's been planning this since June. May plans further ahead than any of us like to admit." He shook his head. The fondness in it was open and unguarded, and he didn't try to conceal it, and Clara thought, watching him, that this was what it looked like when a man stopped arguing with his own heart. The baby came on a Tuesday night in the 2nd week of August. It came fast, the way 2nd and 3rd labors sometimes do, with less preamble and more urgency than Clara had been prepared for, though she told herself afterward she should have known. Agnes had been staying nearby for a week, sleeping in the front room with the equanimity of a woman who has attended 12 births and considers the process straightforward if you don't panic. She didn't panic. What Clara had not anticipated was Caleb. He had been at the house for supper, which had become a Tuesday thing without anyone formally deciding it was a Tuesday thing, and he was in the yard helping Ruth with something she'd been struggling to explain regarding a fence repair on the east side, when Clara felt the first real pain, not the false ones she'd been having for 2 days, but the real kind, the kind that meant the waiting was over. She made it to the kitchen doorway before the second one hit. Agnes was at her side immediately. "All right," Agnes said with the calm of a general who has drilled for this. "Let's get you inside. Ruth, go get Mr. Harrow." "I don't need," Clara started. "I didn't ask what you need," Agnes said pleasantly. "Ruth, go." Caleb came through the kitchen door 40 seconds later and stopped when he saw Clara gripping the doorframe. His face went through 3 things in about 1 second and then settled into a focused stillness that she recognized as the way he looked when something important needed to be done, and emotion was a luxury he didn't have time for. "What do you need?" he said. "She needs to lie down," Agnes said. "You need to keep the girls calm and the water hot. Can you do that?" "Yes," he said. "Then do it." He did it. Clara heard him through the wall, his voice low and steady, talking to May, who had woken up and was asking questions at the volume and frequency of a child who has sensed something large is happening. She heard him answer each question. She heard May's voice settle. She heard Ruth's voice asking something practical about water temperature and Caleb's response and the sound of the stove. She focused on Agnes, and on breathing, and on the work of it. The baby came 2 hours later. A girl. Small and loud and absolutely furious about the whole business in the way of healthy newborns everywhere, announcing herself to the house with a totality of commitment that left no room for doubt about her presence. Agnes handed her to Clara and said, "There you are," with the satisfaction of a job correctly done. Clara held her daughter for the first time and felt something move through her that was so large and so quiet at the same time that she couldn't name it. She pressed her lips to the baby's forehead. The baby stopped screaming briefly, as if she recognized the specific gravity of this particular contact, and then resumed. "She's got opinions," Agnes said. She's a Weston woman, Clara said. She comes by it honestly. Agnes went to the door and said something low to the people on the other side of it. Clara heard Ruth's voice and May's voice, and then May's voice again closer. And then May was in the doorway in her nightgown, looking at the baby with the expression of someone encountering confirmation of a theory she's had for some time. She's very small, May said. She'll get bigger.
This story was
Clara
posted
said.
on the channel The
What's
Rusty
her name?
Saddle. Please do not
Clara
repost
looked at
it
her
in any
daughter.
form.
She had been going back and forth on names for 2 months, had a list, had crossed things off, had argued with herself in the middle of the night, now holding this small, furious person she knew. June, she said. Her name is June. May considered this. That's a cheerful name, she said. She'll know things are going to be all right. Clara pressed her hand over her mouth for just a second. Ruth appeared behind May and looked at the baby with the careful assessing look she brought to everything new, cataloging it, filing it, deciding what it meant. She looks like Papa around the nose, Ruth said. She does, Clara agreed. Ruth nodded once, as if this settled something. She took May's hand and led her back to bed with the practiced authority of a 9-year-old who has appointed herself director of operations. Clara listened to their voices going down the hall, and she breathed, and she held June, and she let herself feel the whole weight of it, all of it. August and Daniel, and the bank letter, and the gate, and Caleb's hand on the amended filing, and May's clover chains, and Ruth's ledger, and this small person who had arrived at the exact moment the world had started feeling like it might hold together again. Agnes came back to check on her and then stepped out to give her quiet. Clara heard movement in the kitchen. She heard the stove. She heard boots. After a while she said, "Caleb." The door opened. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, which was where his hat always was when he was at her door, and he looked at her, and he looked at the baby, and something in his face went so still and so deep that she thought for a moment he might not be able to stay in the room. He stayed. He came to the edge of the bed, and he looked at June the way you look at something that reaches you, in a place you thought was sealed. His jaw was set. His eyes were very bright. "She's all right." His voice was rough. "She's perfect," Clara said. He nodded. He looked at the baby's face, the small clenched fists, the furious perfection of her. He swallowed once. "Thomas was this size," he said. Quiet. Just a fact. Just the truth of it. "I know," Clara said softly. He sat down in the chair beside the bed without being asked. He set his hat on his knee, and he looked at June, and he didn't say anything for a long time. Clara didn't try to fill the silence. She understood it. She let it be what it was, a man sitting with his grief and his gratitude. At the same time, the two things that are the hardest to hold together and the most necessary. "She's going to be stubborn," Caleb said finally. "Look at her mother," Clara said. The corner of his mouth moved. Fair point. June made a sound, not a cry, something smaller than that, a sound of commentary, and Caleb looked at her with an expression Clara was going to keep for the rest of her life. It was the expression of a man who has been away from something essential for a very long time and has just without entirely meaning to found his way back to it. "Can I?" He stopped. He looked at Clara. He looked at June. He was asking something he didn't have the words for, and she understood it completely. "Yes," she said. "Of course you can." She placed June in his arms. He held her the way he held everything he was afraid of damaging, with absolute steadiness and absolute care. June looked up at him with the unfocused, ancient gaze of the newly arrived, and he looked back at her, and his jaw worked once, and that was all. That was everything. Clara watched Caleb Harrow hold her daughter in the lamplight of the room where she'd been born, and she knew with a certainty she had no interest in arguing with that whatever shape this thing between them was taking. It was not a thing she was going to try to stop. It was not a thing that needed stopping. It was a thing that needed room. She was going to give it room. Outside, the August night had gone cool, and the stars over Harlow County were the particular brilliant scatter of a sky that has burned all day and cooled to this clear and enormous, and somewhere in the house, Ruth was sleeping with the ledger on her nightstand, and May was sleeping with a clover chain on her wrist, and the baby, whose name was June, was breathing in the arms of a man who had forgotten for 4 years what it meant to be needed. And Clara Weston, who had walked 4 miles in July heat to a gate she had no right to knock on, lay back against her pillow and breathed and felt for the first time in a very long time that she had made it to the other side of something. She didn't know yet what was on the other side. She only knew it was better than what had been before. She closed her eyes. She slept. Clara slept 4 hours and woke to the sound of May in the kitchen asking Caleb whether June would be able to eat cornbread yet, and Caleb explaining with patience that Clara was beginning to understand was bottomless, where May was concerned that June would need to grow teeth first. "How long does that take?" May asked. "Few months." "That seems like a long time to wait for cornbread." "It does," Caleb agreed. "Life is full of that kind of disappointment." May was quiet for a moment, apparently processing this philosophical observation. "I'll save her some," she said, "in case she's ready sooner than expected." Clara lay still and listened, and felt the morning come in through the window, and felt June warm and breathing beside her, and felt the house around her. This house Daniel had built, this house she had held on to with both hands through 8 months of everything, and she thought clearly, and without grief for the first time in a long time, that she was going to be all right. Not one day. Not just through August. All the way through. She got up. She was slower than she wanted to be and more careful than she liked, but she got up and she dressed, and she walked to the kitchen doorway and stood there. Caleb was at the stove. He had made oatmeal and coffee, and he had found somehow the good honey from the back of the shelf that Clara saved for special occasions, and he had set it on the table without commentary, as if honey on a Tuesday morning were entirely ordinary. Ruth was at the table with the ledger open, which meant she had already updated it for the week, which meant she had been up since before sunrise. May was on the step stool beside Caleb, watching the oatmeal with the focused supervisory attention she brought to all kitchen operations. They were all 3 of them so completely themselves that Clara had to grip the doorframe for just a second. Caleb looked up. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since August, without the careful management she'd seen in him those first weeks, without the practiced distance. Just directly, the way a man looks at something that matters. "Sit down," he said. "I'll bring it to you." "I'm capable of Clara." His voice was quiet and entirely certain. "Sit down." Ruth looked up from the ledger. May turned on the step stool. They both looked at Clara with the identical expression of people who have already decided how this ought to go and are waiting for her to reach the same conclusion. Clara sat down. Caleb brought her coffee and a bowl of oatmeal with honey and set them in front of her and went back to the stove, and Clara sat in her own kitchen being fed breakfast by a man she had gone to beg a signature from 6 weeks ago, and she thought not for the first time that life had a way of moving in directions that made no sense from where you were standing, but made complete sense from where you ended up. The trouble when it came again came from the direction she had least expected. It came from Harriet Doyle, but not the way Clara had anticipated. It didn't come through legal channels, or through Whitmore, or through another petition at the land office. It came through the Ladies' Auxiliary of Harlow County First Methodist Church, and it came in the form of a letter delivered to Agnes Ford, of all people, informing Agnes that her continued association with Clara Weston, given the irregular nature of Clara's domestic arrangements with Mr. Harrow, was a matter of concern to the auxiliary's membership, and that Agnes's standing as a senior member might be affected if the association continued. Agnes Ford brought the letter to Clara on a Thursday morning. She set it on the kitchen table, sat down, poured herself coffee from the pot without asking, and said, "I thought you should see what we're dealing with." Clara read it. She read it twice. She set it down. "She went after Agnes," Clara said. "She did." Agnes's voice was even. She had the calm of a woman who has outlasted many varieties of trouble and expects to outlast this one too. "My guess is she knows she can't touch you directly. Not with Caleb Harrow in your corner. So she's going after the people around you. Who else? Nancy Pierce pulled her daughter from Lily's from Ruth's reading group. Said it was a scheduling conflict. Agnes raised one eyebrow. It wasn't a scheduling conflict. Clara sat with that for a moment. She thought about Ruth, 9 years old, keeping the ledger carrying more than she should. She thought about May with her clover chains and
This
her
story
deliberate
was
patch of
posted on the
clover
channel
behind
The
chicken
Rusty
coop.
Saddle. Please do
She
not
thought about
repost it
June,
in
3
any
weeks
form.
old, sleeping in Daniel's crib that Caleb had carried out of his barn and set up without ceremony. She thought about Harriet Doyle sitting in the back of a courtroom, watching a petition fail and deciding to find a different door. She's trying to isolate us, Clara said. Yes, Agnes said. That's what women like Harriet do when they can't win the first way. They work on the walls until something gives. She picked up her coffee. Question is what you intend to do about it. Clara looked at the letter. I intend to tell Caleb. Agnes looked at her over the rim of the cup. And I intend to stop being careful, Clara said. Agnes set the cup down. Something in her face, old and weathered and entirely honest, went warm. Well, she said, it's about time. Caleb came that evening. Clara told him about the letter before he'd gotten his hat off the hook. He read it standing in the doorway. His jaw was getting that particular tightness she knew now meant he was working through something that made him angry, and he was managing the anger before he let it into the room. Agnes Ford has been a member of that auxiliary for 30 years, he said. I know. This is Harriet Doyle, deciding that if she can't take your land, she'll take your community instead. I know that too. He looked at her. What do you want to do? Clara had been thinking about this since Agnes left. She had thought about it the way she thought through the hard things methodically, without sentiment, looking at the actual shape of it, rather than what she wished it were. I want to go to church on Sunday, she said. All of us. Together. Publicly. Caleb was quiet for a moment. That'll be a statement. Yes, Clara said. That's the point. He looked at her steadily. He turned his hat once in his hands. Clara. His voice was careful. If we walk into that church together with the girls with June, what we're saying to this town is... I know what we're saying, Clara said. I've known for 2 weeks. I've been trying to figure out if I was ready to say it. She met his eyes. I'm ready. He held her gaze for a long moment. The kitchen was very quiet around them, the way it got quiet when something important was happening, and even the house seemed to understand it. I was going to ask you something, he said. I had it worked out. I was going to wait until things settled. Things are not going to settle, Clara said. Whitmore isn't done, and Harriet Doyle isn't done, and if we wait for things to settle, we'll be waiting in separate houses until June is old enough to keep her own ledger. She kept her voice even. I am not willing to wait that long. Something shifted in his face. Something that had been held back for weeks, for months, for 4 years before that came forward and stayed. I don't have a ring, he said. I'd want to do this correctly. I'd want to... Caleb. He stopped. Ask me, she said. He looked at her. He set his hat on the table. He crossed the kitchen and he stood in front of her, and he was not a man who performed things, never had been. So what he said was not a speech. It was just the truth, said plainly the way he said everything. I want to marry you, he said. I want to be Ruth's family and May's family and June's family. I want to keep coming through that gate until it doesn't make sense to keep a separate house anymore. I want to be present for whatever comes next, good and hard and all of it. He held her gaze without flinching. I know what you've lost. I know what I've lost. I'm not asking you to forget any of it. I'm asking if we can carry it together instead of separate. Clara looked at this man who had turned around twice before he made himself knock on her door. This man who had signed a guarantee without being asked twice, who had ridden to Abilene and back in 2 days, who had held her newborn daughter in the lamplight, like something sacred, who had sat at her kitchen table every week until sitting at her kitchen table was simply part of the shape of the world. "Yes," she said. The word came out clear and without hesitation, and she meant every part of it. He reached out and took her hand. He held it in both of his, the way he'd held it on the boardwalk outside the courthouse in July. The same gesture, the same intention, open and deliberate, and entirely unconcerned with who might be watching. "Yes," she said again, because it was worth saying twice. May appeared in the doorway. She had been in bed, or had been placed in bed, and had apparently decided that whatever was happening in the kitchen was more important than sleep, which was a decision May made regularly and with great conviction. She looked at Caleb's hands holding Clara's. She looked at their faces. She looked back at the hands. "Did you ask her?" May said. Caleb looked at May. "Were you listening?" "I was mostly asleep," May said. "But then I wasn't." She came into the kitchen and climbed onto her chair, and sat there with her elbows on the table and her chin in her hands, looking at them with the satisfied expression of someone watching a plan come together. "Did she say yes?" "She did," Caleb said. May considered this for a moment. Then she reached into her apron pocket, where she apparently kept a clover chain at all times, as a matter of standard preparedness, and held it out to Clara. "This one's for you," she said. "Because you need one too now." Clara took the clover chain. She pressed it briefly to her mouth. Her shoulders were shaking. "Thank you, May," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady, and she was not going to pretend it was. "You're welcome," May said. "Can we have honey in the morning?" "Yes," Caleb said. "We can have honey in the morning." May nodded, as if this settled the final remaining detail, and went back to bed. Ruth found out the next morning. Not because she'd been told in the night, and not because she'd been listening, but because Ruth had a particular way of reading the house in the morning, the same way she read the ledger, looking for what had changed, what needed noting. She came to breakfast and looked at her mother's face and looked at Caleb's, and she sat down and opened the ledger and updated 2 lines and closed it. "I need a new green cover for this," she said. "The brown one is wearing through." "I'll get you one," Caleb said. Ruth looked up. She held his gaze for a moment with the direct assessing look that was so entirely her own. "My father's was green," she said. "I know," Caleb said. "You told me." Ruth was quiet. She looked at the ledger. She looked at her hands on the cover. When she looked up again, something in her face had shifted, not softened exactly, more like it had stopped holding itself at a particular angle and had simply settled into its natural position. "All right," she said, and went back to her breakfast. It was Clara knew everything Ruth had to give, and more than most people got from her, and it was enough. It was more than enough. They married on a Saturday in September, 3 weeks after Caleb had asked, and Clara had said yes twice. Not at the church, as it turned out, but in Agnes Ford's yard, which had a large oak tree and enough room for the people who mattered, and which Agnes offered with the no-nonsense generosity that was her defining characteristic. The people who came were not the people Clara would have predicted 6 months ago. Tom Briggs came from Abilene. Walt Sears, who ranched adjacent to Caleb's land, came with his wife and said it was good to see Caleb out of that house. Dillard came, and 2 other ranch hands who had decided somewhere along the line that the Weston household was their responsibility too. Nancy Pierce came without her daughter and had the grace to look Clara in the eye when she arrived, which Clara chose to accept as the beginning of something, if not quite an apology. Harriet Doyle did not come. Neither did Victor Pruitt. Neither did James Whitmore, who had apparently decided after the amended guarantee held and the petition withdrew, and the Harrow name appeared next to Clara's in the county records, that this particular corridor of Soldier Creek was more trouble than it was worth. Clara understood that this was not the end of people like Harriet Doyle or James Whitmore in her life or in the county's life. She was not naive enough to think that one marriage and one amended filing changed the nature of power in Harlow County. What she knew was that it changed her position within it, and that position mattered for Ruth and May and June, and that was sufficient reason. The ceremony was short because both of them preferred short. The minister from the Methodist Church came to his credit, and without the auxiliary's apparent approval, and said the words that needed saying, and Caleb said his clearly and without performance, and Clara said hers the same way. Caleb had a ring. He had ridden to Abilene again the week before, and he had brought it back, and said nothing about it until the morning of the ceremony, when he put it on the kitchen table beside her coffee, and said, "I found this," which was transparently not the whole truth, and which she chose not to interrogate. May wore her best dress and 3 clover chains, and supervised the proceedings with the gravity of a 5-year-old who has been planning this since June, and is satisfied with the execution. Ruth wore her second-best dress, the blue one, and stood beside Clara and held June during the ceremony with the careful, practiced competence of a 9-year-old who has been holding June since the 3rd day of her life and has figured out all the angles. When the minister said the part about family, May took Caleb's hand on one side and Clara's on the other.
This
and
story
stood
was
there
posted
between
on the
them
channel
with the
The
total,
Rusty Saddle.
uncomplicated
Please do
certainty
not
of a child
repost
who
it
has
in
known
any
for
form.
months what the shape of this was supposed to be, and is pleased to see the adults have finally caught up. Agnes Ford cried. She did it efficiently and without drawing attention to it, and dabbed her eyes with her handkerchief, and then offered everyone pie with the no-nonsense hospitality of a woman who believes that grief and joy both require feeding. After, when the others had drifted to the food and the conversation that follows the formal part of things, Caleb stood with Clara under Agnes's oak tree, and they were briefly, almost accidentally, alone. June was in Ruth's arms across the yard. May was explaining the clover chain scoring system to Dillard, who was nodding with the expression of a man who has learned it is easier to understand than to resist. The afternoon light was coming through the oak in the particular way of September light, slanted and golden and unhurried. "I keep thinking," Caleb said, "about the gate." "Which time?" Clara said. "The first time." He looked at her. "You standing there, 7 months along. The way you held yourself together." He shook his head once. "I almost didn't come out. Jake, my hand, he came to tell me there was a woman at the gate, and I almost told him to send you away." "I know," Clara said. "He told me you almost didn't come." Caleb looked at her. "Jake told you that. Agnes Ford's boy talks to Jake's youngest." Clara kept her face entirely even. "Small counties have short distances." He looked at the sky, briefly accepting this. Then he looked at her. "I'm glad I came out," he said. It was not a large statement. He was not a man for large statements. But it carried the weight of 4 years of nothing and the specific, unrepeatable moment of a gate opening, and a woman standing on the other side of it who had the courage to ask for what she needed and the dignity not to beg for it. "So am I," Clara said. Across the yard, Ruth was talking to Tom Briggs with the focused intensity of a 9-year-old who has identified a source of legal knowledge and intends to use it. Briggs was talking back to her with equal seriousness, which Clara suspected he would come to understand was the only approach that worked. May had moved from Dillard to Walt Sears's wife and was showing her the proper technique for joining a clover chain, a tutorial that appeared to be going well. June was asleep against Ruth's shoulder, with the absolute boneless trust of a baby who has decided that the world is a safe place, a decision she had made approximately at birth and had not revised. Caleb put his arm around Clara, not tentatively, not as if he was asking permission, simply with the ease of a man who has decided where he stands and is standing there. She leaned into him. The oak moved overhead. The September afternoon held them in its long light. "She's going to wake up hungry," Clara said, meaning June. "Probably." "May is going to want to come home and make flapjacks." "Definitely." Ruth is going to ask Tom Briggs 3 more questions before he escapes to his horse. "He won't mind," Caleb said. "He told me in Abilene she reminded him of someone." "Who?" "Himself, at that age." Clara thought about Ruth at 40, standing in a courtroom somewhere with her green-covered ledger and her father's jaw, and her absolute refusal to say things sideways, and something warm and fierce moved through her chest. "God help them all," she said. Caleb laughed. The full kind, not the brief exhaled version she'd first heard in her kitchen all those weeks ago, but the real kind rising up out of him, like something that had found its way back from a long distance. Clara turned her face into his shoulder and listened to it. She kept the sound of it like she kept the ring on her finger, and the memory of a gate, and a man who had turned around twice, and the ledger with the green cover that was coming, and May's clover chains on the windowsill, and June's name written in the family Bible that afternoon in Caleb's handwriting beside Ruth's and May's, because he had asked quietly if he might, and Clara had said yes, without hesitation. She kept all of it. Later that evening, after they'd come home, and May had made flapjacks with the confidence of a chef who has mastered the wrist and the timing both, and June had been fed and settled, and Ruth had gone to bed with the green-covered ledger that Caleb had somehow procured between the ceremony and the supper, Clara stood at the kitchen window in the September dark and looked out at the yard and the fence line and the 40 acres that Daniel had built and that she had held on to with both hands through everything that had come for it. Caleb came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, solid and present, and entirely unhurried, the way he stood everywhere he'd decided to be. Clara looked at the dark yard. She looked at her hands on the window frame. She thought about a woman who had pressed her forehead to an iron gate and said please to the morning air and God and whatever was left of her pride. She thought about what it had cost and what it had returned. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right." She turned and looked at him directly. This man she had married in Agnes Ford's yard under an oak tree with her daughters around her and a clover chain on her wrist. "I walked out to your gate that morning because I had no other options," she said. "That was true. I need you to know I know that." She held his gaze. "But the reason I walked back, the reason I let you come through that gate and sit at that table and become part of what's here, that wasn't because I had no other options. That was because I chose to." She paused. "I chose you, Caleb. Everything that came after was a choice. I want you to know that." He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw worked once. His eyes were very still and very direct, and in them she could see 4 years of loss and 3 months of finding his way back, and the specific, irreplaceable weight of being chosen by someone who understands exactly what they're choosing. "I know," he said. His voice was rough at the edges. "I've known for a while." "Good," she said. "I wanted to say it plainly." He reached out and took her hand. He held it the way he always held it, with the full intention of someone who has no interest in letting go. Outside, the September night settled over Harlow County, over 40 acres of grassland, and a fence that held, and a woodpile that would last through winter, and a crib in a room where a baby named June was breathing in the steady, absolute rhythm of a life that was just beginning. Down the hall, Ruth slept with her green-covered ledger on the nightstand, already full of numbers that added up for the first time in over a year to something that made sense. And May slept with 4 clover chains on her wrist and the satisfied expression of a 5-year-old who has understood since the beginning exactly how this story was always going to go. Clara Weston had walked 4 miles in July heat to a gate she had no right to knock on and asked for one thing and gotten back something she hadn't known she was missing. She had held her family together through grief and debt and a county that tried to take what wasn't theirs to take. She had stood at every gate that had been closed to her, and she had waited, and she had knocked again, and she had not once, not for a single day, let go of what mattered. And standing in her kitchen, with her hand in Caleb Harrow's, and her daughters asleep, and the night quiet around them, Clara knew, with the certainty of a woman who has earned the right to be certain, that the long season of surviving was over. What came next was not surviving. What came next was living wholly and without apology in the life she had built from the wreckage of the one that had been taken from her, with a man who had come back a 3rd time, when twice he couldn't make himself, and 2 daughters who were going to be formidable, and a baby named June, who already knew down in the wordless knowing of the newly arrived that she had come into a world where she was wanted. That was enough. That was everything. That was the whole true, irreducible shape of it. And it was exactly what home was supposed to feel like.